decided to sit down because I don't want you to hear the creaking noise of my knees. Start giving me trouble. So, I hope is this mic working? It is?
Yes.
Okay. येनाक्षर समाम्नायम अधिगम्य महेश्वरात् कृत्स्नं व्याकरणं प्रोक्तं तस्मै पाणिनये नमः. At the outset, I want to thank John and Adriana for inviting me to talk to this assembly. And I was working on my talk until the last moment. I had to leave for the airport, so there was not enough time to prepare slides for my talk. But you will see, I'm mostly going to tell you stories about my teachers and my encounters with my teachers and what I learned from those encounters, and you will get some interesting things out of that. First, I want to tell you briefly how I came to Sanskrit. In my family, there was a little bit of a tradition of Sanskrit studies, not in a Pandit Shastri fashion, but the first professor of Sanskrit in my family was my great-grandmother's uncle. His name was Sridhar Ganesh Jinsewale. He did his master's degree in Sanskrit at the Deccan College in 1870, and then he was appointed to teach Sanskrit. And among his illustrious students was Lokmanya Tilak. And what was interesting about Jinsewale was that perhaps because of his study of English literature and Western thinking, he started questioning the notion of apaurusheyatva of the Vedas. And he says if Sanskrit is understood by humans, and if God wanted humans to understand it, it must be a human language. And Jinsewale started giving talks in Pune, saying such things, and people were throwing shoes at him. It was not quite acceptable. And then when Jinsewale, in his lifetime, he collected 3,000 some books in 1880s and 1890s. And when he passed away, all those books came to his sister, who was my great-great-grandmother. And she didn't know what to do with them, so she gave them to a library in Pune, where they are still there. But I still have about 10 of those books I inherited from my grandfather and my father. So during my childhood, I constantly heard stories about Jinsewale. And so how brilliant he was, and how hardworking he was, and you don't do anything. And look at him and so on. So Jinsewale's name was constantly hammered onto my brain. My father, perhaps under a similar influence, decided to do a bachelor's degree in Sanskrit. And among his classmates were people who eventually became very well-known scholars in Pune. S.D. Joshi, Dharmadhikari, Vidyadhar Bide, they were all his college classmates. And so, from my childhood, the only kakas, uncles, that I met were all these Sanskritists. And so I was kind of, what are you doing? What are you going to do, Madhav? So, what do I know? So they had kind of predetermined that I should go in that field. When I was 10 years old, I was fighting with neighborhood kids, and my father was really seriously worried about, how I was going to do in school. So my father took me to the Tilak Maharashtra Vidyapit in Pune, and he showed me around and said, "It's a beautiful library. Why don't you come and study here instead of fighting with kids in the neighborhood?" And then Tilak Vidyapit used to offer Sanskrit exams from very beginning. So we have exams called Prathama, Dvitiya, Tritiya, and Chaturthi. And then there will be Shastra Parikshas beyond that. behind the first 4 exams. So in my 5th grade in school, I started going to this Tilak Vidyapit 1 hour a day. And the main attraction was that I would get better grades in my school if I get some training in Sanskrit. My first teacher in Prathama class was Bhagavad Shastri. And as it turned out, I kept on studying with him for the next 12 years. Now in my regular school, Sanskrit began at the 8th grade. But I was going to Tilak Vidyapit to learn Sanskrit from my 5th grade. So in that one subject, I was ahead of all other kids in my class, because we had to study physics, chemistry, 4 languages, Marathi, English, Sanskrit, Hindi, 4 languages, plus science and mathematics, all these subjects. But in that one subject, I was ahead of the class. And that situation continued until my 11th grade, which is when you finish that 11th grade, you pass a statewide exam. And in that exam, in the subject of Sanskrit, there was a scholarship. That scholarship was called Jagannath Shankar Sheth Scholarship. And this was instituted in 1850s. And from then onwards, every year, the scholarship was given. So students would work very hard to get the scholarship. So I will tell you about the teacher who trained me for that scholarship a little bit. His name was Pandit N. Bhide, and he was simultaneously teaching German and physics and Sanskrit. And then he tried to integrate all those subjects in his own mind. But how to train your student to win this scholarship? Because you have 150,000 students appearing for the exam, and how is your student going to shine within those? So if you just do correct, Nadi Atra, Nadyatra, and all Sandhis correct, I mean, there would be 5,000 students doing all this correctly. So how will you shine? So he had developed a technique that suppose we ever ask, Nadi Atra, then you not only do Nadyatra, but then you write a footnote. This is high school final exam. You write a footnote. In the footnote, what say? By the rule, Iko Yanachi in Panini, this Sandhi is accomplished. Okay. And then this is a form like Bhavati. It says, well, everybody can say what Bhavati means to be. He is. But then you write a footnote and say, Tiptas Jishiptas Tamib Vasmas. And he made us memorize all these rules of. Now, at that point, I didn't fully understand what those rules meant. And he used to joke that, if you have a snake bite, recite this, and the snake bite will be automatically cured. So my introduction to Panini began like this, that we memorized probably like 50 rules of Panini, and then where to quote them in footnotes. And then his regular class in school was just, whether you pass or fail, it's your luck. But he would invite those students who wanted to try for that scholarship to his home on Saturday, Sunday. And the rules for that class were, if you make one mistake, you go home and never come back. And if you're 5 minutes late, just don't come back. Okay. So on the first day, there were 12 students. Second week, 6 remaining. Third week, 2 remaining. And finally, I was the only one, who stuck through the rest of the year. And so on that one subject, I spent 90% of my energy, but there were 7 other subjects. Math and science and Hindi, Marathi, all these subjects were there. So I did okay in those subjects, but I got the Jagannath Shankar Sheth Sanskrit scholarship. So when I got that scholarship, then the question, until then, my father was kind of thinking I should go to commerce. And he has talked to the commerce college principal, and it was almost like a predetermined that I will go to commerce. But then suddenly I got this Jagannath Shankar Seth scholarship, and every newspaper in Maharashtra had my photo, and so what should I do? And then of course my father's friends, including S.G. Joshi and others, said, no, you have to take Sanskrit in college. And their logic was, if you're doing okay in Sanskrit as well as you did in this exam, you will get a job in some college to teach. So don't worry about getting a job, because that was a big concern. If you take Sanskrit, what kind of a job will you get? So then I took Sanskrit in my college, Ferguson College in Pune. I went to, but I continued studying with Bhagavad Shastri alongside. So Bhagavad Shastri had time only at night to teach. And during the day he was very busy. So he says, okay, I can teach you 8 to 9. And then why will you go home after 9? So sleep in the library here. So the Bhagavad Shastri lived just behind this Tilak Vidyapith building. And so he would open the library for me and say, oh, go. So I had a rollaway bed stashed in a cupboard, and I would sleep there. His class 8 to 9, I was the only student. At 5, the phone would ring. It says, are you awake? Okay. I said, okay, come up. So I had to go to his house, and he was the only person awake. Everybody else was asleep, 5 in the morning. And he had made tea for himself, and I would get a cup of tea made by my Guruji. That was such a fortunate thing. Then 5 o'clock, I get my cup of tea with him, and then I had to go to another teacher. His name was Yashwant Rao Marathi, and I studied Nyaya with him. And he was totally blind. He didn't need any book. He had memorized most of the major Nyaya works. And so he said, okay, well, come around 5:30. So I walked to his house. He would leave the door a little open for me. Didn't want me to knock on the door to wake up other members of his family. So I go in, it's pitch dark inside. And he says, if you need the light, turn it on. Because he didn't need the light.
Yeah.
And so we were sitting across, and so I read my initial Tarka Sangraha kind of work for him, and then slowly read some beginning Navya Nyaya works with him, and so that's how. Then after that, then I would go home, then take a shower, eat something, then go to college, and then in the evening back. So that kind of was the routine. Now, with Bhagavad Shastri, I remember reading Pravda Manorama, and not the whole thing, but a decent part of that, and then Nagesh's commentary on Pravda Manorama. And he was, in his own way, he was quite open-minded. Though he came from a Pandit traditional background, he still was very open-minded. So a couple of instances that I remember, and then eventually his teaching got recorded, and Mallar knows a whole set of CDs were published of his teaching Siddhanta Kaumudi to students, and so it's like 300 lessons. They're all in Marathi. Conversations are all in Marathi, but and so eventually I got, so that was done in 2007, many years after my time, but I can still listen to his voice. So a couple of things I remember in his teaching. So one was, So we were just reading Tulyasya Prayatnam Savarnam. So, Tulyam Asyam. Okay, Asyam, what does Asyam mean? Prayatna, what exactly is Prayatna? So if you read Siddhanta Kaumudi, then Prayatna gets subdivided into Abhyantara, in so-called internal Prayatna, and then the Bahya Prayatnas. And it says, okay, to decide what Savarna is, two sounds must share the sthana, asya referring to sthana, and then prayatna, the effort, different kinds of efforts involved. And the tradition from Patanjali onwards say both Abhyantara Prayatna and Bahya Prayatnas are involved in deciding Savarna. And then Bhagavad Shastri's personal view was that that's not quite correct, that only the Abhyantara Prayatnas should be involved in deciding this. And there was he told me this story, that there was a meeting of the All India Oriental Conference in Calcutta, and he went to Calcutta and delivered his paper saying only Abhyantara Prayatnas should be included and not. And then he says there were many Shastri Pandits in the audience who did not agree with him. But that was okay with him. He somehow held on to his view on that count. The other interesting discussion with him that I remember is on Vipratishedhe Paramkar. So as you know, there has been a lot of discussion recently with Rishi Rajpur's dissertation and so on. But the discussion with Bhagavad Shastri, so Vipratishedhe Paramkaryam, and then the next Akadarat Eka Samajna. So should this Vipratishedhe Paramkaryam apply only to this Eka Samajna section of the Attadhyayi, or should it extend throughout, excluding the last Tripadi, but should it extend to the whole thing? And he said the first time the idea that this is extended and should be extended comes from Katyayana. And Katyayana has a Vartika which says Numachira Trijvat Bhavebhyo Nut Purva Vipratishedhena. So Num, then the Achira Ruta, and Trijvat Bhava. Trijvat Bhava refers to Trijvat Krushtu. The word Krushtu can occasionally function as Krushtu, and that is the Trijvat Bhava. And all these rules follow the rule that prescribes Nut, but in looking at the forms, that Nut needs to apply, overriding these three. And so Katyayana's Vartika says Nut Purva Vipratishedhena. So you have conflict, and here the previous rule precedes over the subsequent rules. If you look at all those rules, the rules for Num, Achira Ruta, Trijvat Krutu, and the rule for Nut, they all are outside of this so-called Ekasamjna section. And so it's quite clear that as far as Katyayana's understanding was concerned, Vipratishedha extends beyond that Ekasamjna. And then Patanjali makes it even more explicit. And once you expand it throughout the Attadhyayi, what happens in many cases, you still need that Purva Vipratishedha. Not only in the cases that are noted by Katyayana, but in many other cases, the previous rule applies. So then Patanjali says, para in Vipratishedhe Param Karyam. What is Param? Para Shabdaha Ishtavachi. Whichever is the desired rule, Purva or Para, the desired rule applies. So you are kind of doing reverse engineering in a way, looking at the form, looking at the output that you need, looking at the kind of Shikta Prayoga, and then decide which rule takes precedence over which. And so Bhagavad Shastri was, he said, this is all fishy. And again, coming from a Pandit-like background, it was amazing to see him say that. But then, if you don't accept the tradition, how do we solve the problems that are still there? And then his suggestion, he actually says this thing in the recordings. Though I remember my own learning from him in the recorded lessons. He says, maybe some PhD dissertation could be written on this subject. And then we have a recent dissertation, not that it solves all the problems, but the problem is still there. And then how do we resolve that problem? We still have to come up with some more solutions, some further solutions. So, in Ferguson College, it was more like a Western style teaching, though teaching for Sanskrit was in the Marathi medium. But our teachers were kind of proficient in English and Marathi. So the one teacher I distinctly remember, and I learned several things from him, his name was T.G. Mainkar. And he was the principal of the college, but he also taught Sanskrit. And so he taught Kalidasa, he taught multiple things. But then I distinctly remember his teaching of the Bhagavad Gita. And teaching the Bhagavad Gita, he had previously written his own dissertation on comparative study of the different bhashyas on the Bhagavad Gita. And sort of he would not make us read that book, but he would make use of analysis that was presented in that book. And so a couple of instances come to my mind. What exactly is the text of the Gita? Okay, so we as students just had a printed text, printed by Gita Press or Nirnay Sagar or something, and we said, well, that's the text. And he says, well, that's not exactly historically the case. So what is the problem there? So he said, okay, we'll look at a verse like Nasato vidyate bhavo nabhavo vidyate sataha. So in old manuscripts, there are no avagraha signs and there are no gaps between words. So when we look at modern printed text, there are the avagrahas, there are gaps between words. So somebody has already done an interpretation. Okay. So nasato vidyate bhavaha or nasato vidyate abhava. Somebody has to make the decision. So Shankara makes the decision one way. Na asataha vidyate bhava. Asat has no bhava. Asat has no existence. Nabhavo vidyate sata. There is no abhava of sat. That's how Shankara reads this. Nabhavo vidyate sata. And Mainkar would put Madhvacharya's interpretation before us. It says, Nasato vidyate abhavaha. There is no abhava of asat. And nabhava vidyate sata. The resulting is, neither sat nor asat have abhava. Both exist. Okay. So that comes as a shocking understanding. Well, what is sat and asat? So if you look at the Vaishnava schools, then sat is Vishnu, asat is something, because it is Dvaita of Madhvacharya. Different from, though dependent, but different from Lakshmi, the Prakriti, the Jivas, asat. Na asataha vidyate abhava. And then so that sort of example kind of opened my eyes. And he says, okay, when we look at text, really, if you want to go really deep, we have to forget about the printed editions and go to manuscripts that don't have gaps, that don't have avagrahas, and so how would you interpret a text like this? And I will give you an example later where this teaching from Meinkar came very handy to me. So the other example he would mention is Traigunya Vishayaha Veda Nistraigunya Vavarjana. So Shankara says the Vedas are filled with three gunas, but you have to get out of those three gunas. Nistraigunya Vavarjana. Well, if you have to get out of three gunas, what happens to Vedas? So you have to abandon the Vedas. What do you do? Again, Madhvacharya says, Traigunyam eva visham tad yapayanti, apagamayanti iti traigunya vishaya. Nistraigunya, how do you become Nistraigunya? Using the Vedas. You become Nistraigunya. And so again, how do we analyze those compounds? Does the text itself give us any indication, or we put something of our own in interpreting the text? And so those were sort of very revealing kinds of teachings, and sort of helped me throughout my own research later on. Now, as I finished my 4 years of Ferguson College, during those 4 years, something interesting happened. And our teacher for Kavya Prakasha, his name was Professor Patwardhan. Patwardhan worked with Jeffrey Mason and translated parts of Natya Shastra and Shantarasa, the Nyaloka translation they jointly did. So Patwardhan was teaching Kavya Prakash, and in Kavya Prakash there is a distinction, two types of upama, figure of speech, upama, and those two types are listed as Shrauti upama and Arthi upama. So Shrauti upama is something that is directly communicated by the words. Arthi is something you have to impute something. So that's kind of the ballpark meaning. Now, how do we distinguish Shrauti from Arthi? So Nagesha Bhatta has a commentary on Kavya Prakasha where he argues in his own way that the distinction is based on Sadharmya versus Sadrishya. So the two terms seem very similar, but there is some distinction there. And Nagesha argues that Shrauti Arthi distinction is based on Sadharmya versus Sadrishya. And Patwardhan in the class taught something quite different. And he says, Dharma versus Dharmin is a different distinction, and Shrauti Arthi is based on that sort of distinction. So I was reading Nagesha before going to the class, and I raised my hand and I said, Sir, Nagesha Bhatta says such and such a thing. So Patwardhan says, I know that, but then 20-some years before this episode, S.D. Joshi was his student. S.D. Joshi was Patwardhan's student. And S.D. Joshi argued against Nagesha. And Patwardhan had asked him to write out an argument, and Joshi wrote out an argument against Nagesha and gave it to his teacher, Patwardhan. And Patwardhan was convinced, and then since then, Patwardhan was following Joshi's understanding. And 20 years later, I'm Patwardhan's student, and I said, I don't agree with this. So Patwardhan asked me the same thing. So can you write out a Khandana of S.D. Joshi and justification of Nagesha. So with my Tilak Maharashtra Vidyapit background, I wrote in Sanskrit. a long khandanam, and gave it to Patwardhan. And so he said, that sounds okay to me. And as circumstances would have it, H.G. Joshi's original paper that he wrote for Patwardhan was published in a local Sanskrit journal in Pune. It's called Sharada Sanskrit Patrika. And then I told the editor that I have written a khandana of this. So next month, my khandana appears in that magazine. And so H.G. Joshi was, terribly angry. And of course, I used to call him Kaka, he's my uncle. And so he came to our home and said, to my father, so how could your son do this thing? And so it kind of illustrates to some extent the kind of training that I went through in that Tilak Vidyapith. Because studying Nyaya, studying Vyakarana, we were kind of partly trained in some ways to engage in kind of debates. There was a Shastra Sabha in 1966 in Pune, and several Pandits from Kashi and Chennai and so on come to participate. And I was a student, undergraduate student, but Bhagavad Shastri kind of trained me, and me and another student in sort of like a fake debate, on some grammatical point, go on the stage and he presents one side and you present the other side. So we did it, and we got some prizes from there. But H.G. Joshi was in the audience, and a Pandit was saying something about Patanjali's understanding of some rule in Panini, and H.G. Joshi raised his hand. So this is okay, what would you like to say? So Joshi just stood up. So he said, well, before you say anything, you have to accept Trimuni Pramanya. Do you accept Trimuni Pramanya? So for the first time I heard H.G. Joshi publicly saying almost that, no, I don't. I have the freedom to disagree. And then the Pandits on the stage did not allow me to continue. So that was 1966. And so I knew H.G. Joshi as sort of this very uncle-like figure. I did not know much about, his academic views either. But I heard that in the public forum, that he feels he has a personal right to disagree if he feels. If Patanjali can disagree with Panini, why can I not disagree with? I need some reason to disagree, but we should have freedom to disagree. And so that's how the Pune culture was partly tradition, but tradition coming out into modernity. And so this was the way. So after finishing Ferguson College, I went to study at the University of Pune. And then my primary subject I had chosen was Vyakaran. So H.G. Joshi was one of the teachers. And Palsole, G.B. Palsole, some of you have probably seen his work on Dhatu Patha and so on. So he was another teacher. And then Professor Devasthali. So Devasthali has published a number of books on Panini. Anubandhas in Panini and Sara Siddhanta Kaumudi and Pit Sutras, and so Devasthali has published a number of different things. So those three were our teachers. Now what happened during a week, there was usually 2 hour sessions, and we had the entire Paribhashindu Shekhara prescribed for our exam, and a large chunk of Mahabhashya, first 9 Anikas were prescribed. So H.G. Joshi was teaching those, and Joshi felt that there was not enough time on campus to study all this. So you, the students, have to come to my home every single day. So we were only 3 students. So myself, Rodbergen, who then collaborated with Joshi on translation of Mahabharata afterwards. So he was my classmate. And then there was a lady, her name was Jayashree Gune, so she was the 3rd student. So we would go to Joshi's home, and 1 hour, 2 hours go by, and then it's still teaching day after day after day. So he just took incredible detail and understanding of every paribhasha, every part of Mahabharata as he understood it. During that period, he was working on 2 books. First book that came out was his book on Kaundabhatta's Phota Nirnaya. And my job was to read proofs. So I would read the proofs and give correction. No, while he was translating, he would write translation by hand, give it to a typist, he would come. Next day he would tear it up and then say, no, that's not a good translation, let me redo it. And so often he redid the translation 3 times, 4 times, until he was just completely happy with the translation. And so that is another kind of training for students as well. Just don't go by the first impression that you have some. The other thing that I learned a lot was from his introduction to that book. So Kaundabhatta comes, and then of course Nagesha comes later, but Kaundabhatta pretty much towards the tail end of that grammatical tradition. But the arguments about Spota, arguments about other things, date back to Patanjali and Shabara and Kumarila and Gangeshan, they go centuries back. And A.G. Joshi was tracing the history of evolution of the notion of Spota in the introduction. And so again, sort of how to trace history of some doctrine. You cannot just go by one text and say, okay, this is the line, this is the transit done, Lots of these things sort of help me in my own work, but sort of the beginning of sort of that in-depth training happened in Pune. The other work that he was doing was his translation of the Samartha section of the Mahabharata. That was the first part of Mahabharata translations that came out. And again, I had to read some proofs and so on. And so that was just enormous education that happened. Now, A.C. Joshi felt that like his own situation, he came from a very traditional Pandit background. Then he taught Professor Ingalls in Pune for some time. And then Ingalls said, you are so brilliant, why don't you get your bachelor's degree and then I'll give you a scholarship to come to Harvard. Until then, A.G. Joshi had not gone to first grade. He had been trained in his Pathshala of his uncle, but never went to regular school. So, all of a sudden he went to an adult education class and finished his high school degree in 1 year, and then went to college where he was my father's classmate, and then he went to Harvard, and it's kind of the rest of the story. But his dual education sort of convinced him that it is important for his students to have similar dual experience. So he had sent Ashok Akluskar to Harvard, and then another student, Savdamani Bahulukar, she was also sent to Harvard. So when it was my turn, so Harvard was already filled. So it says, they don't have any fellowships left anymore. So he wrote to Professor Ludo Roche in Philadelphia, and I Pune to Philadelphia and joined University of Pennsylvania. So there, I was taking courses with Ludo Roche, Mark Dressler in Western, some courses with George Cardona. And for the first time in my life, I took a formal course in linguistics. Until then, I read, Bloomfield's book on language and there's some other introductory books I had read in Pune, but I had never taken an actual course in linguistics. The very first course was Henry Königswald, a famous historical linguist, and I took his class my very first semester at Penn, and I had those notebooks but then somehow they got lost. I was taking my notes in Sanskrit, sitting in Königswald's class, writing notes. Then so I had to go talk to Professor Königswald and I had to write a term paper. So Königswald says, since you're here to do his PhD relating to Sanskrit, write something related to Sanskrit. So one thing sort of said, he was not a scholar of Panini, but we have general reading about Panini. So he said, why don't you write something about Panini? So I said, well, what can I write that would be of interest in the sense of historical linguistics? So I started thinking about this, and so I said, okay. I during our readings of Mahabhashya in Pune, I noticed a few things, so I did not carry them forward at that time. So one was, so Panini has Acharya Nirdesha, it refers to many acharyas in his rules, and then in some rules he said Desha Nirdesha, so Pracham, Udicham, and so those are the so-called Desha Nirdesha. And when it comes to Katyayana and eventually to Patanjali, they say, well, they are for pujartham. They're only to show respect to those acharyas, but they don't carry any sort of functional significance because all they produce is an alternate form. And so they are as good as Vibhasha. And so of course this was predating Paul Kipatski's work on Va and Vibhasha. It's the prior understanding of Vibhasha is just an option. So Acharya Nirdesha is just a Vibhasha. So with that understanding, then while reading Siddhanta Kaumudi, we came across a rule which says Va supi apisalehe. Va supi, there is Va in the rule and there is apisalehe. So I would have taken this as, according to Apishali, there is an option. But the tradition says, Apishali granam vyartham, or Va granam vyartham. Some such thing, because what do we achieve by having Va and Apishali? They do, both of them do the same thing. And so to write a paper for Königswald, then I kind of took that sort of a notion. I said, why is Katyayana rejecting his Acharya Nirdeshas, and why is he doing this, and why is Patanjali? So if some of the Vartikas in Katyayana says, Va vachananarthakyam svabhava siddhatvat or nityatvat. Something, the language is nitya. So there's no point in saying Va. The words are already there. Whether to use them or not is your choice. But both words are sadhu, no matter what. And so Va vachana anarthakyam, anarthaka. Swabhava siddhatvat. And so I wrote a term paper saying, well, Panini was more interested in describing sort of dialectal variation in some sense. Katyayana already shows tendency toward a more philosophical approach of nityatva of language and things like that. Patanjali kind of again follows that line of thinking. And so a whole paradigm had changed. And under the new paradigm, sadhutva of words is important, but saying this is optional or this is found only in one dialect, it didn't carry any weight for these later grammarians. And so that was kind of the beginning of my historical thinking relating to Paninian tradition. That the tradition, on the face of it, would produce a picture of sort of absolute continuity, just like the Vedic Pandits would say, nothing was ever changed. Absolutely, exactly, Guru Mukhat, Shrutam, same thing. And so the Vyakarnas would say the same thing. But that's not exactly the case. Change does appear in different ways. It could be change in the language, it could be change in ideology of language. So there are multiple ways change can take place. So that's what I wrote for Professor Hyonig's one. And I was studying with Cardona, and Cardona had a very Pandit-like background from his studying with Pandits in Banaras and Baroda and so on. But then the one thing I remember is that he would ask, and even Peter Sharp remembers this. Same thing happened when he was a student. That Cardona would ask some question, and before we would answer the question, just looking at our face, he would say, no. So Peter Sharp counted how many no's. He said 9 no's. And so it was like a terrifying situation of answering, Cardona's questions. But we did fine. I did fine. And before I started writing my dissertation, Cardona went on a year's leave. And who would replace him? Cardona's teacher, Paul Thiemer, came from Germany as a visiting professor at Penn. And it was just an amazing experience of studying with Thiemer. And again, the class of 2 students, I think Jayashree Gunde and I probably were the only 2 students doing Panini with him. And so with Thiemer, we were reading something or other, and then I don't remember whether it was Jayashree or someone who mentioned, just she brought Ronu's translation, and Thiemer was explaining something in one way, and Ronu's translation went in a different way. And so Thiemer says, Renu is like Yaska, I'm like Panini. So he did not elaborate what that meant, but so probably in his opinion, Yaska is not as trustable in his etymologies, not as exact, more imaginative perhaps, And Thiemer thought, it's more exact. You have to have proof for everything. And so in his own writings, argument for it. So I had to write again a term paper for Thiemer. And so what did I do? So I said, well, let me write on Taparas Tatkalasya. Okay. So there's a little background to this, why I chose that. Because when I was studying in Pune, my high school teacher who introduced me to Panini, and said Taparas Tatkalasya. And so my teacher in Pune, he firmly believed that the same Patanjali wrote Mahabhashya and the Yoga Sutras. So he would insist that Patanjali's understanding of Panini is trustworthy because he had yogic insight into what Panini meant. And that's how Patanjali derives his authority. And so we came upon this Taparastat Kalasya. And then reading Siddhanta Kaumadi, and Taparastat Kalasya, Siddhanta Kaumadi says, what is Tapara? Siddhanta Kaumadi gives two interpretations of Tapara. It says, Tafparo Yasmat, it's Bahuvrihi, Tat Paraha Cha. So Tapara could either mean when Ta follows or precedes. Tafparo Yasmat Bahuvrihi, Tat Paraha Tat Purusha. So I asked Bede Guruji, and he said, how could there be two interpretations? Because from my meager understanding of Swaras and Swara rules, if it is a Bahuvrihi, it is the Purva Pada has retains its Swara. If it is Tatpurusha, it is Antodatta. So, the word Tapara, what is it? It can't be both. Cannot be simultaneously Adyudatta and Antodatta. Of course, the text as we have it has no accents. But assuming that Atadhyayi was accented at some point, that's a question of big debate. But if it was accented, it could not have two accents on the same word. It would either be one way or the other. It couldn't be both. And so I had that in my mind, and so I suggested to Professor Thema at Penn, why don't I examine these two interpretations and examine Panini's rule and say which one makes sense. And so he said, okay, that sounds like a good topic. So initially I took a sample of maybe 20, 30 rules in the Atadhyayi, and so the rules that have the and that don't have the, and what is Tapara doing. And I gave my draft to Professor Thema. He looks at the draft. Well, it looks okay, but there are 4,000 rules in the Atadhyayi. You have taken only 30. So, what kind of generalization can you make based on such a tiny sample? So take the next 4 months and go to the library, sit, and he did not ask me to go through Mahabharata or Kashika. And he said, all rules that have the rules don't have the, and come up with a more extensive draft. And so next 4 months I'm sweating in the library, working through the book, and wrote a pretty long paper, gave it to him, and he was finally happy with it. And that was my first academic publication. Thema took it to Germany, and then it was published in this Vergleichung des Sprachforschung that he was editing. And in a kind of a Western style, that was my first academic. Then I wanted to do my dissertation. So again, my Pune background kind of came with me. So S.J. Joshi had done Spota Nirnaya. So I said, well, what should I do? So I studied other parts of Kaundavatta. And I said, well, why don't I work on a different chapter of Kaundavatta? So Namartha Nirnaya. But then Namartha Nirnaya and Vyakarana Bhushan is very small. So Cardona suggested, don't go to Bhushana Sara, but go to Vyakarana Bhushan. And so that's a much bigger chapter dealing with the same topic. Well, the initial problem was quite obvious, that Vyakarana Bhushana Sara has multiple commentaries, and there is not a single commentary, and Bhushan is the main big Bhushan. But I had to work through the text as we had it. So I did like a few paragraphs, translated, showed him to Cardona and said, okay, well, translation is okay. But then, do you know how far back this argument goes? Okay. Because, Counter Bhatta and Nagesha, they are arguing with Nyaya and Mimamsa, especially these two systems. And many arguments, there's the word referred to Vyakti or Jati, go back to Katyayana all the way, or to Mimamsa Sutras and Nyaya Sutras. And so Cardona kind of forced me for every single argument in Namartha Nirnaya, trace its history. Because otherwise translation itself would be a quick thing. But you have to go through this whole thing. And then write out in your explanations, your introduction, all the histories of all these arguments. And luckily for me, there were other teachers that were there at Penn. One was Professor Bimal Krishna Matilal. He was here in Wolfson, right? At Oxford. Was he at this college?
No, he was at All Solar.
Oh, okay, another college. But for that 1 year, he was at Penn. And I got a chance to read Gadadhara Bhatta's Shaktivad with him. And so that was very critical to understand Namartha Nirnaya. The arguments against Nyaya. Where do they begin? And so that was very useful. The other thing that was very useful to me was that there was a class in Western philosophy of language. And so I took that class. And so that class kind of, in one semester, covered from Aristotle and Plato to Wittgenstein and Bertrand Russell and, Carnap. So like a big survey of theories of philosophy of language. And that kind of really helped me translate Namartha Nirnaya using kind of terminology that would be comprehensible and appropriate in English. Because otherwise, what terms does one use for those? So, I finished my dissertation for a brief period, for like 2 months. I went back to Pune, and a job was supposed to be there, but it did not materialize. And all of a sudden, I got a phone call from Michigan saying, "We are trying to contact you for a job, go to such and such a place and wait for our phone call." And so this was like a windfall job from the Department of Linguistics in Michigan. And so after 2 months of returning from Philadelphia back to Michigan. So my job was in linguistics, and I was teaching Sanskrit. I was teaching a few linguistic students, and so one of my very first PhD student, his name was Jim Baer, and James Baer wrote his dissertation on phonetics and phonology in Panini's Atadhyaya. And so in preparation for his dissertation, I read Pratishakyat and Shikshas with him. And so that kind of directed me and my own research away from Kaunda Bhatta and Namartha Nirnaya, that type of thing, into phonetics and phonology and so on. And then eventually I ended up editing this Atharvaveda Pratishakya Chaturadhyayi. And so 2 of my colleagues in Michigan in linguistics were absolutely helpful. One was Kenneth Pike, again old generation, old school phonetics, and sort of I'll derive my phonetics terminology to translate the Pratishakya from Kenneth Pike. And the other person who was even more directly involved in helping me his name was Professor Ian Catford. And so he was from Scotland, but he taught his life long in Michigan. And he was a student of Keith at Edinburgh. And he was interested in Pratishakyas and so on. And so again, how to make Pratishakya rules kind of comprehensible in English. Catford and Pike were both instrumental in that work. And then gradually, my interest turned towards sociolinguistics, from phonetics to sociolinguistics, because I got into discussing origin of retroflexion. And so Hans and I have some different views and that. But I mean, discussing origin of retroflexion suddenly got me into migrations, Indo-Aryan migrations, perhaps contact with Dravidian and other populations, and impact of such contacts on languages, mutual exchange of features and things like India as a linguistic area in those areas. And so that's how sort of things went on. And the title of my talk, like I said, from Panini to linguistics and back, all that I mean by that is that there is more to Sanskrit than linguistics, and there is more to linguistics than Sanskrit. And so for me, Sanskrit is my sort of primary basis. And my return to Sanskrit happened in some interesting. When I was in college in Pune, I used to write a lot of Sanskrit poetry and publish it. Until almost I came to Philadelphia, I wrote and published lots of Sanskrit poetry. Throughout that stay in Michigan, 45 years of teaching, there was no occasion, no audience for Sanskrit poetry, and so it just kind of went dormant. And close to my retirement, 2016, 2017, I started writing Sanskrit poetry all over again and published quite a lot. One thing I started doing was writing one verse on Krishna per day, and then put it on my Facebook and WhatsApp group, and with translations in English and Marathi and so on, share it. They accumulated to 2,700, 2,800 by now, and ongoing. So a publisher in Delhi is publishing the first 2,700 Krishna shlokas with my own English and Hindi translations. And from Pune, the same 2,700 is Marathi translation. They should be coming out in the next month or so. So, thank you so much. I thank John.
I suppose we have time for one question.
Thank you very much, Madhav. The phrase water under the bridge is probably appropriate, but with regard to your candida of S.D. Joshi's thing, in hindsight, do you have a feeling that you were right, or was he right?
It's on the Shrauti Arthi, because Matilal agreed with me. In a way, Matilal, then eventually Matilal asked me to write that in English and was published in the Journal of Indian Philosophy. So I gave time to that.
Okay. Thanks again.
Thank you.
Now we have a coffee break until 11 o'clock, and then we have the poster sessions, which is in the same room as the coffee break, which is lunchroom. See you there.
Thank you.